All right. So let's start. So thank you again, everyone, and welcome to the session, the second session of the Gaming Guild. Um, and I guess for Ronan and for the people who have just come in, this is the second session, and the first session was mostly around us introducing what the Gaming Guild was all about. And one thing that we did do there was we started, I guess, defining what we hope was the theme of KB7, which was consilience, and I will talk about that in a bit. And then, and yeah. Uh, so yes, this is the second one. We'll be having two more upcoming gaming guild sessions. The third one we were hoping to talk more with more Web2 developers to discuss what they think should be done in Web3, and then the last one is discussing more about something more forward-looking, which is what does this all mean in the context of the open metaverse or what going to come soon. Sorry, Victor, you there? Um, yeah. And to begin, I guess it's good for us to have a short introduction on the folks that are joining us. So first we have, of course, Ronan. Ronan is a Kernel alum. What block were you in again, Ronan? Was it the second one?
I was, I think, in the first one, 0, and the third one, maybe. I forgot.
Yeah. So as always, Kernel, the hope is Kernel is something that propagates even after the blocks. And we have, of course, the good folks like Ronan and Andre who come back and help us out. And Ronan has been, before Kernel, he's already been doing a lot of stuff on Web3 and on games in particular. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the greatest example of that is Conquest ETH, which is, I guess, one of the only truly on-chain games and infinite games that are being built on Web3. He's done a lot of other things as well. We'll talk about a little bit about his other games. We'll talk about, but he's also done some non-game Web3 projects like mandalas, generative art, and some of the tools that we use like hard hat deploy. Yeah, and maybe before that, Ronan, maybe you want to do a little bit of intro on your end also.
I mean, yeah, yeah. Basically, my background is a game dev, and so when I discovered Ethereum, like the idea was like, oh, build unstoppable game was kind of how I took it, and then I had to build tools and play with NFT, like you mentioned. But yeah, I don't know what to add.
Cool, yeah. Thank you, Ronan. And then, of course, I want to introduce back Andre. So Andre has been helping me out with the Gaming Guild since the beginning. And I just wanted to shout out the JS13K community, which Andre just, which just recently finished their 11th competition, where a lot of game developers make games in just 13 kilobytes. And yeah, Andre, maybe just a few words from you also.
Yeah, so the competition runs since 2012, and as you mentioned, we had the 11th edition, and the winners were announced literally yesterday. And we do have the decentralized category since 2 years now, with developers, Web2 developers trying Web3 technologies, taking on the challenges and building some cool games as well. Within the 13 kilobyte size limitation, which is tough but not impossible. So I totally recommend checking out the games. And if you're curious how the games were built, keep in mind that all the games have their sources on GitHub. So you can literally check how any of the games submitted to the competition were built.
Yeah, and some of those games were pretty fun. And if some of these screenshots seem like they're pretty dark, the theme was death for this time around. I think it's also a good time because it's also October, it's Halloween, so it's fun to play these games. Some of them are really fun, and it's impressive that they're just 13 kilobytes. And later I'll show like something fun that Ronan and Andre did with the small bite size of these games. All right, yeah. So So our hope for today is we want to discuss a little bit about infinite games and board games. I know some of the Kernel fellows are working on board games, and there is definitely a lot of similarities and a lot of things that are applicable on for either board games, even infinite games, even in just mobile games. And
Nee, het is nu wel goed, dus ik hoef niet camera meer aan te zetten en ook niet meer.
Sorry, guys, I'm just muting everyone. And then, yeah, so I guess I want to start with bring it back to how we ended the last session, which is the hope was we wanted to explore more about consilience. And consilience is a term that was, I guess, popularized also by E.O. Wilson. It is a conviction far deeper than a mere working proposition that the world is orderly and can be explained by a small number of natural laws. So E.O. Wilson is a biologist. He was studying ants and he was looking at I guess the systems that govern how ants behave. And one thing that he also came to the realization to was that there were a lot of silos that a lot of these other connected fields were in. For example, in his case, in this diagram example that he had, environmental policy, ethics, social science, and biology may seem like they're different fields of study, but they're all kind of related. And before he passed, he was thinking more broadly about ecosystems and how each of these were connected. And as Kernel Fellows, I think we are in a unique opportunity as game designers to also have that sense of consilience. A lot of the folks in Kernel aren't just game developers; they're designing governance, they're designing they're musicians as well, artists, and also they're designing token ecosystems. So there's a lot that we can learn from all of these other fields. And for games in particular, like even in this subset of game design, for example, play to earn game design is there are a lot of play to earn folks in Kernel talking about, of course, finance, about how to design a proper token ecosystem. But there are other fields, like how do you make a more narrative-driven game? How do you make a more mobile-focused game? Like one example is Zynga, when they were one of the bigger, I guess, the more popular games that they were. The zeitgeist of game development was mobile social. Zynga was one of the mantras of Zynga was the game developer or the player should have fun in 3 clicks, and that kind of thinking has kind of, I guess, is diffused to most of the games that we play now. So if you play a mobile game, a lot of them are designed in such a way that that the moment that you start the game, you're already having fun. There's no long narrative. There's no long introduction. And they found that that's the way that the games should be made if you want them to be very retentive. And yeah, so I guess with this start, I wanted to get, I guess, some thoughts from both Andre and Ronan on consilience. Maybe I know maybe we can start with Andre. I know Andre, you've been doing JS13K for a while. You've seen a lot of games being made. So it's like 11 years of game developers making games with you in your community. So it is, I guess, do you find that this concept of consilience, is it something that's applicable to games? Is it something that that maybe there's some threads you can share with us from your learnings in running a community for 11 years and having them make something around a common theme?
Well, can I pass this on Ronan first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I know it's
sorry, but,
it's a lot. It's like a lot of terms that we're talking about. So yeah. So maybe how about you, Ronan? I know you've been thinking about games from a different lens from traditional game developers. So yeah. So with this concept of consilience, is it something that you feel that is relevant? Is it something that game developers should be thinking about?
So I mean, in the fact that things come from different, that we need to bring different topics or different subjects together, it's kind of what, if I understood correctly, right? That's what this thing. I mean, if it is, I mean, for me already the game, video game especially, it's really already a mix of lots of different things. I mean, you could make a game without art or without anything, but usually a game gets a lot of added bonus if you have a nice story, you have some nice art, and so it's already a confluence of a lot of skills, and a lot, but maybe even beyond that, like if you never had experience, like you will not be able to make a game. So the more diverse experience you have, the more, I guess, you can benefit from it in a game. But I think, like, yeah, I think it's not only about game, it's probably for everything, but maybe game because it has this technological, especially video game, technical thing that is maybe very cold, but it on its own cannot make a game. So you need to have to bring idea and think from outside. I don't know if I am at all
No,
on,
yeah. No,
on
I
the
agree.
subject.
Yeah, like just the fact that games are like a video game in particular, as you mentioned, is mostly done by not just one developer. Like there's an artist, there's a game designer, so it's like a confluence of these fields. And yeah, so I guess maybe it's worth it to continue the discussion on the next slides. I think we will maybe just come back to consilience in a while once we see all the threads coming together. But one thing I did want to touch on was your history, Ronan, on making these games. And I think it's gonna be useful context for everyone who's thinking about what kind of games to make with the technology that we have. And I guess one amusing thing that I saw was that your first Unstoppable game was a game that you made on Status. Status, for people who don't know, also is Andy was Crypto Wanderer is also part of Status. So there's a nice little bit of connection there. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this game, Ronan, and how you thought of making Unstoppable games.
Yeah, so I think so that kind of go back to the beginning. So I was a game developer working on like web game and mobile games, and then I stumbled upon Ethereum, and I always remember the website back then. It was a picture of the Far West, and there was this sentence: build unstoppable applications. And for me, as a game developer, it was like build unstoppable games. And I was really fascinated with that idea. I started to code in it, and it brought me back the idea of the way I started programming was on calculators. Our family didn't have a computer, so my only thing I could program on back then was actually on a very simple graphical calculator. And this limitation of the machine was it bring me that back when I was discovering Ethereum, and so I quickly realized that we can't do a very complex game, and so actually before Tug of War, what I did was a platform where players were playing a game on chain like classical, but they were submitting the proof of their move on chain. But that was kind of it was kind of a pragmatic decision of like, oh, okay, I cannot do this kind of game, so I will do that. But then later I realized, maybe we can play with what we have, and that's kind of where Tug of War come from, where Status was putting a hackathon, online hackathon, and I thought, let's do that. So my brother and I, we actually developed this very buggy game, but it was actually working. And to be fair, we were a bit because we didn't want any prize for it, and the game, because there was a game category, the game that won the prize had nothing to, they only had slides, they had nothing, and it was basically a gambling game. So we were quite upset actually, but it didn't stop us to continue. So we released a less buggy, actually quite good, I think, a version, but we never put it on mainnet. But the idea was that it was a very simple game, a bit like rock paper scissors, but more complex, where you have to you specify a number, and there was a player, so it's a 2-player game. You deposit money each to make sure that you will play, and the winner take all, basically. But the cool
Yeah,
thing about it is that it was like on a smart contract, nothing else. I mean, the front end could be replaced by anything you wanted.
I guess that's what made them unstoppable, right? Like you
Yeah,
don't need like all of these the front end that you created, which is very cute, but you don't need that, right? You only need to interact with a smart contract. That's what makes it unstoppable. And I think you also made a good point there, Ronan, on a lot of the games early on, and I think even still now, a lot of them are very much like gambling games. And it's also because of the medium, right? Like if you just want games to be on chain, um, that's naturally what you'll be thinking of, I guess, just sending transactions and getting something back. So it's the design kind of became like that. And yeah, so
One
before
thing I
this,
noticed,
yeah, Andre, sorry,
can I
go
add
ahead.
something? Yeah, so
Of
one
course, yeah.
thing you mentioned that the game was really simple, just rock, paper, scissors, which was also one of the games in the decentralized category in the competition last year. So like there is a discussion that we should, like the community in general, developers should build good games and we shouldn't release crap into the world. But I'm really into encouraging developers, especially those who were participating in the competition, that they try really simple mechanics to create something that just works, and then they can iterate over it. So like starting with something very simple, very basic, and then learning and building more complicated things is totally the way to go. So it's not like, oh, it have to be a polished, perfect creation from the start, but like let's build something simple. Let's build something that just works, and then iterate over it. So I think it's kind of important to know that you can make small, simple games that are your proof of concepts or just demos that you learn from, and then iterate over them.
Yeah, definitely. And and yeah, like Andre has seen a lot of these games being made, so that's really sage advice for everyone. And yeah, and maybe just to continue on Unstoppable and on chain. I know like you mentioned, Ronan, that the you came to the term unstoppable because of the Ethereum, I guess, literature, right? Like they were talking about unstoppable game or unstoppable protocols,
application,
um,
yeah.
applications, yeah. And I shared the blog earlier that you posted on Infinite Games, and I guess your thinking has gone from unstoppable to on-chain, and then also autonomous worlds in Infinite Games. And I think one thing that I like there also is I think some of the people talking about on-chain games have the same ideas about what makes an on-chain game good or I guess applicable to the medium. You mentioned it here. I think it was shared by one of the
Ryan,
sources
yeah.
that you linked. Yeah, about the source of truth of the game data as a blockchain. The game logic and rules are smart contracts, and the game is developed in accordance with open ecosystem principles. So maybe we can talk a little bit about these bullet points, Ronan. Like what does each of these one mean?
Yeah, so this is from actually Brian from Dark Forest, who published an article on that. And yeah, I mean, so the first one, the source of truth. So I mean, I cannot put his words. I mean, I it would be my interpretation, but so for me, it's like that the logic and the main logic of the game and the state is on the blockchain. And so if you want to update that state, you have to perform a transaction that, yeah, and so that to do basically that update. So I guess that's the second one. So I mix the two here, the second step, but I mean, I guess they depend on each other.
Yeah.
And the game is developed in accordance with open ecosystem. So I think this is quite important on the long term. That I mean, we see already open source have won most of its battle over the last, of its existence. It's quite amazing. I think if we I mean, it's another subject, I guess, but it's amazing that open source, it's a huge human achievement. Open source, it might be the most most amazing thing that we have managed to, things have been put in the public that anybody can use, and it's quite a strong thing in the crypto world in general. A DeFi ecosystem that is not open source, or at least you can't see the code, it's not something you might want to play with it. Having said that, like, it doesn't need to be from the get-go. Like, you can still build. It's actually what I do with Conquest. So I build slowly open source, and the core game is still closed. But the idea is that when it's ready, then it can be open, and when it's open, it allows people to even contribute further. And the other point, the game is client agnostic, is actually basically automatic. If you, of the 2 points, if the source of truth is actually on the blockchain, then anybody can build a front end. There is not anymore any reason you cannot do your own. So and the last point, I'm not really sure what you were saying with that actually, but I think it's probably the idea that that on the blockchain, like, things can have value, and so you can make use of this. And in Conquest, I actually make heavy use of it, in the sense that if you want to play, you have to bring something at risk in the game.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that point, I think how game design also moves in Web3 is people I guess take ideas from things that have been successful as well, like real world value digital assets. Of course, that was the start of NFTs as well, right? NFTs kind of colored how we create games. We wanted to put NFTs in our games to kind of see how we can play around with that mechanic. So yeah, so that, similar to what you mentioned, Ronan, on how unstoppable became kind of unstoppable, and immutability, I would say, was kind of what the things that people were thinking of when they're making Web3 games. So that kind of made games go that way, I feel. And
Immutability. Yeah, it's interesting that actually immutability are not mentioned here, right? And I think it's a very important point. And I think
I put it on the next slide. Because I moved a little bit.
Yeah, no, but that's actually because, I see that's how I compose my article on infinite games, and I add this point, because I think immutability is something, as a traditional game developer, you find counterintuitive or counterproductive even. But it's funny, but and in my article, I remember putting to some friends for comments, and one of them commented on that. I had a very strong, the game is immutable, and I added some sentence that even if it's immutable, you can still fork it and make your own version. So instead of thinking, I will have this instance that will be perfect, that I will fine tune over time, instead just launch an immutable version. And if it's not perfect, it's fine. We just launch a new one again, and again immutable, and we evolve that way. And the reason why it's important is because if the game is not immutable, then nothing can be built on top. I mean, I exaggerate a bit, but imagine Ethereum keep changing its rule, and that was controlled by a consortium, kind of how it is, if you want, in some way. I mean, it's not really the case, but because there is this ability of forking that Ethereum have. But assuming it was not the case, yet you will not want to build on something that can change, or at least that can easily change. I mean, Ethereum have kept backward compatibility, and it's strong. It's an important thing for all the application out there. But so immutability, I think it's crucial, and I think that's really one of the definitive feature of on-chain game. I mean, if you can change it like why do you have it on chain, kind of? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you put on the blog also, wherein infinite games are crypto native on-chain games that preserve the properties of the underlying blockchain. And you mentioned forking, right? I think that's how a lot of these chains were able to become, I would say, unstoppable, right? Like to the forking mechanism, like anyone can change. Like a change has to be under consensus, so it's like the properties of the blockchain are hopefully preserved by the games that we're making by making them immutable.
Yeah.
But I guess, yeah, I guess a step before that, I wanted to discuss a bit about infinite games, because infinite games, um, like there's many ways that it can be defined, right? I know, like Ronan, you started with Unstoppable and thought of infinite games as the games we're building on chain. In Kernel, one of the syllabus articles that we have was about Dr. Karas, who of course defined finite and infinite games in back in the 80s, I think. And in his case, like finite games were games that are meant to be won, that these games have a finite duration, that they're meant to end. While an infinite game is played for the purpose of continuing the play. And his ideas were that we play these infinite games are games where we want more people to join. Well, the rules can be changeable, and but in your case for infinite games, I think while there's some differences in how it's defined, it is still very similar. Like infinite games, I guess we can think about some of your games that you made as an example, and I put here Eternal, which is one of the games that you made before, and it's very different from other games in that it's not, I guess, similar to other games of the genre. It's not designed in the same way. So maybe you can talk a little bit about Eternal and what the core idea for that was.
Yeah, so I think it evolved a lot. So Eternal, it started as a very simple prototype without a grand vision, just having like, let's have a dungeon crawler on chain, and every time you move, you discover a new room, and that was the basic prototype. There was no attack, just room to discover, and I think there was some item in the room, but at the beginning you couldn't even pick them up. But that was kind of just that, and then there was the combat mechanism. But yeah, the cool thing about that game was that all the question it bring to the designer, like, what if okay, so now every player discover a room, it's kind of his room. Do we give him something about this? Do we have the capability to maybe to do something special in that room? And I think we spend a lot of time like kind of discussing how we will set up. It was not yeah, it was designed also as an infinite game, like in the sense that this dungeon will live forever. There was no limit, so in practical term the dungeon was infinite, so you could keep exploring. We were introducing like the more you were further from the center, the more difficult the monster were, and then we had few ideas of how to maybe even have different level, so you have discover new kind of territories. And in the graphic here, what you see is actually the different testing session we made. So every time we made a new testing session, we were starting a new game with new features usually, and testing out how it plays. But it was a PvE. There was no PvP. That's how like I envision how we could scale without having I mean, I think it brings also a lot of issues. PvP have interesting properties, but I think it's I mean, I would love to revisit that game. We had to stop it, but I would love to revisit. I don't know if you have like any particular question or.
No, yeah, I think that was a good insight on how you guys were thinking of designing the infinite dungeon crawler. I guess to dive a little bit deeper there, when you started creating Eternal, what were the references? Like, what games were you thinking of, or was it like was there an end state that you guys were imagining? Like was combat a
So
part of the design at the start, for example? You mentioned that it wasn't, right?
yeah, so the original, the main inspiration was the MUD game, the mud game of the past. So like
Okay,
where
yeah, like the text-based dungeon crawler
yes,
games where you can kind
yeah.
of do whatever you want, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean to some extent. So there was a lot. The first version was like there was no map actually, and everything was text based. And the idea was to the main work that I found was fine. It was fascinating, but also a lot of work for me was how do we make generative text that makes sense on the rooms. It's trying to make a world completely text based. And I play tested in Japan in DEF CON. It was the last DEF CON actually, DEF CON 5. And I remember the first thing people ask, like, hey, you need a map. We need a map. We can't play this game because people were quickly lost into the labyrinth that it was. And so we added a map. And then when you add a map, suddenly you want to make it nicer. And then so it become more visual and the text remained. So when you play Eternal, you always had the text telling you what you were, but it was secondary. You didn't really need anymore to read it, as you mostly was visual. But yeah, the main and actually, if you look at Mud game, most of them also ended up being maps. They still have text, but because map become very useful. But I know the mud tradition. I mean, it's very fascinating. I explored just the surface because I'm not a player of this game, but I was starting to look at them. And the main reason I think it's funny is like when you play with this limitation, you have to go back. You have to deal with this limitation, and so you quickly realize that, oh, wait a minute, you just have to go back 50 years ago or like 40, 50 years ago, and then see what people were doing with this limitation, and you realize that of course you can have fun like with many things, and so that's kind of what, yeah, the origin of Eternal, really.
Yeah, and I really like that point. I think that's a great segue to what Andre is doing with JS13K, right? Like the limitation kind of brings about innovation because it's there. Like a lot of the game jams, for example, they provide a theme because that limitation allows you to be more creative. I feel sometimes it's the the just so much choice and so much options allow makes it harder for you to decide what to do, right? And Andre, is there something
Yeah,
you
I
wanted
think
to add?
like many developers are like when they learn about jumps without themes, they are like totally confused. Okay, what am I gonna work on? Because it's like too many options, too many things to consider. So the theme is like a mandatory thing for a jam because when it is announced, you can immediately start thinking of some ideas you might have for like game mechanics that maybe you wanted to use or some of the demos or something, and immediately it starts your thinking on like game ideas, etc. And with size limitation, so there is a saying I really love: limitations spawn creativity. And I could totally see how incredible and insane entries people are submitting over the years to the competition, which is limited to 13 kilobytes. But we, like last year, we had a Quake 1 tribute, which was literally with like different levels, weapons, enemies, sounds, music, and whatnot. And it was like totally mind-blowing how someone put all of that into this small zip, which they wrote in a postmortem. So it was really cool to read about that and see the postmortem, see the sources, how you can creatively and like not in an obvious way pack so many content into the limited size. So I think the fact that there is a theme plus there is another limitation that okay, so I can't put like music in MP3 and I can't put big images into my game. So maybe let's read about procedural generation. Let's see if I can scale really tiny assets or like generate them on my own. So this is something that I think developers really enjoy while participating, that the competition is really like forcing them to learn about different optimizations, different techniques that they might not use in their work.
Yeah, and yeah, the games that come out of JS13K are really very technically impressive and really fun. But I guess before we move to the next slide, Ronan, you mentioned hyperstructures here. Just
Yeah.
reading through the paragraph, yeah, like become an invitation to build games, allow extensions to be hyperstructures themselves. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the term come from Zora, the creator of Zora, who see Zora, like, which is basically a on-chain marketplace of NFT, that once you build, basically in some ways, the protocols, it's like protocols, and so they are there and they will live forever, and they allow you to do things, and you can build on top of these. And so if you make a on-chain game and you make sure that the API allow people to build things on top, then so the game become an hyperstructure that other can build upon. And so I think we see that. I mean, with Conquest, Conquest don't have a lot of players right now, so it's not really a living proof, but in its concept, it allows people, because the game never stops, it allows people to build things on top of the game, and they remain there. So you could build like another, so this idea of alliances, or I don't have really an example now of things that will last here, like, but the idea is that it's possible. If your game is immutable and persistent. This is the two, and I would say the other one also, basically interoperable, because if it's not interoperable, then there is you cannot build on top. If it's not permissionless, then yeah, I guess it probably this permissionlessness derive from the other, probably, because that kind of the thing, like if you had to go to your government to be able to use any of the blockchain, then we will not achieve anything. And so, yeah, but so these four ingredients are really the same. So I think hyperstructure was written in the context of a protocol of a marketplace. And for a game, I call it infinite game, but it's almost like a synonym term. Yeah, that's how I see it. And I think before maybe moving to that, I think the main thing I would like to add to that is that for infinite game to work, you need to ensure that so there's few problems that can come, like if you naively so for example, for Eternal, if you naively implement PvP, because PvE was a way to kind of solve the problem, but it make it less interesting in my opinion. But if you have PvP, then you have the problem of Sibyl, or if you create many accounts, and so your game could technically be infinite game, but then it will not work because you will be vulnerable to attacks by bots that can just. So in Conquest, I solve it by the staking mechanism, where you need to stake money to participate. And so the only way you can multiply yourself is by multiplying the risk you introduce for yourself. And I feel it worked very well, but I hope we can find different mechanism as well, because it might not be for everybody to risk something. But today, I don't think there is any other way, like, or maybe proof of work was kind of what we have.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think there's a little bit of consilience there, right? Like when you mentioned hyperstructures and games that last for a long time, like infinite. I'm reminded of maybe the Uniswap protocol. Maybe that's one of the
Yeah.
most hyperstructure like things out there, where it kind of allowed people to build things on top, like ERC20, and then maybe a marketplace like Zora, as you mentioned, allows like NFTs, like game mechanics around NFTs to be created. So it's worth thinking of what the DeFi folks are doing, what these protocols are doing, and seeing how they build game-like mechanisms and how we can kind of use that also in what we're building. So that's really a good term to remember, is hyperstructures.
Paul,
And I
can I
guess
jump in
now,
really quick?
yeah, sure, Ryan.
Another thing about the hyperstructure that's really important, and I think like awesome, is that it's feeless outside of like paying a gas fee. So you have something like Azora, where it's like this baseline marketplace that Ronan is saying you can build on top of, but the baseline marketplace isn't charging fees outside of gas. So it's like, it can't be, the incentive to be forked is basically goes away. So the real value is the marketplaces that are built on top of it that can charge their own fees, but you have more trust in like the layer one marketplace that you're building on, because you know there's not going to be, it's not going to fork in the community, or it's not, there's the potential for it to be forked is mitigated because there's no incentive to like lessen the amount of fees that there is if the fee starts at 0, which is pretty interesting. Like game mechanic just in that. And it kind of touches on like a free to play type thing too.
Yeah, and you mentioned bot guilds as well, right? So that's another challenge. So Ronan mentioned that people can just create their own accounts like Sybil and not be Sybil resistant. So that incentives is also something we do need to really think of.
The bot guilds thing, because I was just saying that kind of as a joke, but like if you think of it, if that was an actual game, some of these some of the most press or the most what was that thing where the artist, I forget who it was, but they basically like created an NFT and then had it change and basically like rug the whole community. But the point was to prove that the whatever it was, the JPEG graphic or something, because it wasn't on chain, could just be changed at any time because it was hosted on like Dropbox or something like that. So by that artist doing that, like all of a sudden it's like all this press and every single blockchain blog or news organization, they wrote about this because it was like an artistic like presentation of what was wrong with not having assets on chain. It'd be interesting if there was a game that kind of like opened up these doors for these like bot guilds to form, just to prove like it's showing forecasting the problem before other people just like haphazardly build games that don't think about the Sybil thing and like turn into disasters as infinite games. But it may be like a cool idea to like build a game that kind of like leaves the door wide open for this like Sybil problem of like bots being, and now you have like bot wars where it's like but like bot guilds, as I called it, like attacking each other, just to prove the point of like, this is what will happen if these things aren't thought of in the beginning from people that are developing these things.
Yeah, and I would say
I like that. Yeah.
Like Ronan's game, of course, Conquest East and Dark Forest, some of these games have thought about this a bit more deeply. So bots are accounted for. In Ronan's case, it's the staking, right? Like you need to increase the value that you put in. So even if you have a lot of accounts, then that's accounted for. But yeah, like we need to explore these mechanics. And yeah, maybe I know we took a long time to get to board games, but I wanted to go here because I think it's something that not fully explored. And with Ronan's article, he kind of ends it with mentioning that Conquest ETH was also mirrored around the play by mail games, where people would play by sending snail mail to each other, and people are just using that form, that medium, for playing a game. And and yeah, so I think it's fascinating. One thing that I wanted to mention also was one of the games in that we like playing in the earlier kernel blocks was Among Us. Among Us is a game about trust wherein you don't know whether the players in the game are either out there to kill you or are there to help you out. And Among Us is actually also, I would say, inspired by a lot of board games. So The Resistance is one other board game that has the same mechanic. The Resistance itself was based out of Werewolf, which is a simple, a much more simpler game, but based around the same mechanic around you don't know who to trust and you need to figure that out by conversation. Um, and and yeah, so my hope also is we get to play this in the next few weeks. We'll schedule a let's play soon. But maybe I want to talk a little bit more about Conquest ETH, Ronan. I know that you've been making Conquest for quite a while. You mentioned that it was inspired by Starweb. And one game that I myself played a lot before was Subterfuge, which was a bit similar to the gameplay, wherein it's all about controlling resources and really communicating with all of the players in the game. So yeah, so Ronan, maybe can you talk to us a little bit about what Starweb was and how that inspired what you were doing with Conquest? Oh, sorry, Ronan, you're on mute.
Yeah, so actually, the inspiration was not Starweb. I came back to, so when I started to write this article, I started to look deeper into like game in general, and I knew about play by mail because of especially Diplomacy board game was easily one of the most famous game using play by mail. But I kind of read further and I found Starweb. So it was more after the fact. The main inspiration for Conquest is actually a game that is also called Conquest, but with a K. So it's a game that is on Linux, KDE, and it's a very simple game. And actually so when I was looking deeper, I realized that Conquest, I like many actually Linux game are actually based on existing game in the past, and it was based on a game called Galactic Conquest, and then which itself is based on further. It's a very interesting story back in the early days of computing. I can share the article. I think I have it somewhere, the link. It go back quite early, even to a game that nobody know who did it. Like it's kind of funny, like they forgot, they don't have a trace to see who did it, but and yeah, Conquest is very simple. It's a grid. You have a certain number of players, and the universe is limited. And really, so to me, when I discovered that game, I mean, I played quite a lot before, but I realized, oh wait, it could be a nice on-chain game. But for me, when I put something on chain, I don't want just to make the same game and put it on chain, because that's what I could have done with Conquest. I could have said, okay, here is the rules. Okay, now let's find 4 player, 5 player, have this little universe, play the game, and then there is a winner. And I think this is something that others have done. Like, for example, Dark Forest is this kind of game where you have a game, it's closed, you finish it, it's done. For me, when I wanted to bring something on chain, I wanted to keep these properties of the blockchain, which is like it's persistent, basically what we mentioned before. And so for Conquest, the question was, how do I make that scale? How do I make sure? And that's where the Sybil problem come into play, and the staking mechanism come as a solution for it. But there is also a lot of interesting problem even today in Conquest. Like for example, right now there is the Conquest, the first infinite version have been launched in April, and it's keep running now forever. But quickly, I mean, maybe in 1 month, 2 players managed to take control of the universe, and so still some people have tried to actually build bots to fight them, but currently it was a failure. But yeah, so and it's interesting, especially on that context. What is interesting for me is like I always wonder, is it just a gimmick that I play with, and I could actually have done the same game using traditional technology? And that's why it's interesting to see Subterfuge. There is also another game which is actually open source called Solaris. And it's also same like Conquest and Subterfuge. But what is interesting about Conquest and these games is that by making it infinite, you also solve some of the game designer issues. So traditional game have issues when you have a lobby mechanism. You have to make sure you have to find this player in the first place. So you have this basically this trace point where unless you are already a popular game, you will not be able. You will have to wait a lot of time before someone can join your game. And secondly, I think it's even most important. You don't know if you are. So actually, there's two other problems. You don't know if you are playing against players that join that are basically. So let's say the game can only support 6 people. If you are playing 1 against 5 that are already joined together, it's completely unfair. Like so there is unfairness. And second, which I think is probably more common for game designers, this issue is how do you make sure that the player will play the full game? Because that's very frustrating when you join a game and suddenly one of the players leave, and maybe it's a neighbor of your enemy. So your enemy have suddenly a big bonus because he can just capture that player who left the game. And as a player, it's very frustrating. And so it's interesting that my goal was not to solve these issues. My goal was just to make it an infinite. But by doing so, it solves some of the design problem of traditional games. So I think it's a clue that we are onto something. We are into a new kind of games that was not possible before. And so that's what fascinated me about on-chain game in general.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's really interesting that making it infinite solved a few problems, but of course, you're also dealing with some new problems as well, like when you mentioned like bots as well, and getting people to continue playing. But yeah, it's an exciting new design space, so there is a lot to learn from board games. I like that you kind of made that connection and are learning from what others have already done in the past. I think that's something that not a lot of people do. It's look at what's already been done, and I think that's what being part of Kernel also helps us, is not just games, like certain other fields will allow you to see how to make certain systems work properly. And I think we're almost finished with our slides, but just to end a little bit on what was discussed before around making things iteratively. I know, Andre, you mentioned also that when you're making a game, you should iterate on it and put it out there. I think when Ronan mentioned that you put Conquest ETH out or Eternal out, we put a first immutable version out and then make another one that allows you to build it, to iteratively build it better. And I think there's something to learn from board games also in that aspect, wherein board games aren't as hard to make versus, for example, making a smart contract. It's not so technical to make, I would say. For one good example that I point people to also is Amber Case created a DAO game, which is how do we build better DAOs, and it's just a fun little game that you can play even with cards. So I suggest people take a look at it. In games also, like there's this term we call gray boxing, wherein when you're making a level, you don't make the whole level itself. You just make things as lo-fi as you can. So this example on the right is just a level that's just made of gray boxes, and that's why they call it gray boxing. I think it's a nice analogy to making games very lo-fi with just cards and paper, and then just moving towards more highly technical ones. So you don't need to write smart contracts. You can make board games first. And Andre, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, just a small thing that in the competition, it's kind of crucial to have the very first working prototype as soon as possible, because many people who failed to submit anything, they were like, going wild on what could be in the game, and like then trying to make it work in the last hours and failing on that. And some of the most successful games were the ones that someone built a prototype in like the first, I don't know, like the first few days for brainstorming, but then building a prototype in few hours with like squares and anything else. And then seeing if the core game mechanic is fun enough, if it works, if there's any point in working on that, or maybe throwing it away and trying something different. And then if it worked, then like iterating over it, getting some feedback, and constantly sharing that, getting opinions, and then trying things out. But then if something didn't work for you very well, then you can revert to the previous version and start again from that point. So it's not like you're working for a month and it's not launching and it's totally a mess, but you have some save points, you have some iterations, versions that you can revert back or use as a starting point again. So I think that's the building a prototype is kind of crucial to have as soon as possible.
I like that analogy with save points. So it's like your game, making the game itself is sort of like a game, right? Cool. And yeah, so I guess we'll wind down. We'll have a few questions at the end. I saw a question from Ruzi that for Ronan. But before we get to the questions, one thing I wanted to share was that for those who are building games, the guild hacking channel, there are a lot of folks there who are building some non-games as well. So I think it's good for us to connect with some of the people developing and just get some builder energy. So do join the guild hacking channel. There are some good examples there of some little things that people are building as well. So if you look at the open source code and learn from them, that's one good step also to get some inspiration on what you're building. And one last thing, I did mention that there was one fun thing that Ronan and Andre worked on. So one thing that Ronan or Andre was working on is 13K, right? Which is these games which are just 13 kilobytes. And one thing that they did was they put the whole game itself on top of a blockchain. So this is Andre's game Triska, which is I would say an example game for JS13K, and you can play the whole game on OpenSea. But the challenge was OpenSea kind of updated their.
I just sent you the link on the chat for I just deployed a new one on Girly.
Just right now.
No, I mean, which is before while we were talking like at the beginning.
That's fast. Yeah. So yeah, check that out. If you can see on the link that you can play the whole game on OpenSea. So I think one thing also that we discussed in KB7 was we were hoping to make a collective artifact. I was hoping to get some of the people to take a look at the code that Ronan created. Ronan, do share if you want to share the code. We can.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'll do. I can do that right now.
Nice,
actually.
So let's have a discussion on maybe let's make this one of the base code that we'll use for that artifact. I think one thing fun is like we can make a game that the KB7 group or the gaming guild has created and put it up there, and it's all fully on chain, which proves out. I guess one use case for blockchain that a lot of game developers are kind of wondering about. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean
yeah, sorry, Rona, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the cool thing for me is like because of this limitation of 13K, so the way it's implemented to kind of to get the cheapest way is that you can store data as a smart contract, and the smart contract on Ethereum have a limit of 24K. And so in some ways GS 24K, but it's actually interesting because GS 13K is a zip file, and you can't, so the way the system works, we can't have a zip file. We have to have a single HTML page. So I changed Triska a bit to be fully in one HTML page. And Triska, I forgot the zip size, but here it's 22K, I think. So it fit just into
Yeah,
the smart
the
contract.
Triska was like a really small proof of concept. The zip size of Triska is like literally 5 kilobytes or something like that, because there is
Okay.
no sound, no music. It was only to have a proof of concept that it could be small and fun, but it could still fit in the size limitation. And yeah, as you mentioned, in the competition, the zip is 13K, so people are able to squeeze like 50 or 60 kilobytes into the zip. So obviously not all the games that used all the space of the zip will be automatically end up there, but like the concept itself of turning OpenSea into a gaming platform really blows my mind. So I'm really curious to see like this movement of game developers throwing games at OpenSea and saying that, do I use Newgrounds or like Congregate? No, we can use OpenSea. So it's like, you know, a game
It's funny.
portal that you can play games on. So I'm really curious to see what people can build with it and how we can expand on the concept and what we can see being built.
Yeah, so I think it's a great a great example of just something really quick that's been done, and we can build something big out of like a games marketplace, as you mentioned, Andre. Yeah, so thank you everyone. So I guess let's have a little bit of discussion on one of the questions from Druzy. So Druzy, do you want to hop on and ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, in general, like what led to the decision to kind of move on from the project and not, I guess, like continue actively supporting it? Was it just kind of moving on to other games you wanted to build, or and I saw the code that you sent. Thank you for that. And yeah, just curious on like how it is composable, and if anybody like picked it up and kept it running in their own way or anything after you moved on to other projects.
Yeah, so I think the main reason it was shut down is that we were two people working on, we were two founders on it, and we had very different view, a different vision. So we spent a lot of time really deciding what to do. We were open each other, so we spent a lot of time like, oh yeah, we should do that, oh no, we should do that. And as time passed by, we were kind of using resources to a point where we had to stop, because we couldn't really have a single vision that went further. Like I kind of that summarize a bit what happened. So we decided to release everything open source at the end. There was few interest at some point, but then nobody built on top. I would like, actually personally, I would like to revisit it, a few new ideas around it. I think it's a shame. I feel like what happened, it was a decision. I don't regret the decision to stop, because was the best thing to do at that point. But overall, it was a shame that we couldn't make it like up to the mainnet at that point. It was quite early because there was no much on-chain game at all. I mean, there was experiment, but yeah, that's kind of how it ended.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I was just, yeah, I was curious if it was like a technical thing or if it was just like the cost of playing it or something. So that's actually really interesting to hear that it was just kind of a normal pragmatic decision. Yeah, I'm interested. I'm definitely going to take a look at this. My idea for my venture is super similar to this.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to chat about more if whatever, like yeah, I would love to see it revive, even if it's a completely different thing. There is a lot of interesting thing about you know, you mentioned like the cost of running or playing. We spend a lot of time trying to think of different way. Like we, for example, integrated the live bar of the player was actually the gas. So you were paying upfront the gas, and it was your live bar. And every time you move, it was completely abstracted away. There was no like MetaMask. It was just the bar was moving down, down, down until you didn't have food anymore. Maybe something you could be helpful for you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
That's cool.
That's cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I do remember some people trying to fork Eternal. I don't remember though, like I wasn't able to keep track of it. But yeah, it's good that it's all open source. Cool. And thank you everyone for staying. I know we ran a bit over time, but I'll stop the recording now. But thank you for attending. And for the next session, we'll discuss more on what Web2 games or what Web3 games should be built in the context of what Web2 people know about Web3. So thank you, Ronan and Andre. Thank you everyone for the time. And yeah, see all of you soon. So let me just stop the recording.